This is Embodied, our show about sex, relationships, and health. I'm Anita Rao. When journalist Meghan Keane was in her late 20s, an opportunity fell into her lap. She was asked to start a show for NPR that would give actionable advice to listeners. You might have heard it.
You're listening to Life Kit from NPR.
While at work, Meghan had become known for being a steady, calm presence who could bring the best out of everyone. On a personal level, she was feeling a lot less put together.
I was a few months off of a breakup where I had been blindsided for the second time. And I didn't have a lot of confidence, to be quite honest, about how I thought about my work and myself. And Life Kit was really an opportunity to throw myself into something that I was like, I think I could do this.
Life Kit is now into its 6th year, and Meghan has learned a lot about giving advice. She even recently authored her own self-help book, Party of One, Be Your Own Best Life Partner. When I read it last fall, I was like, this is some really good advice. But more than the specifics of the advice Meghan doles out, what struck me was her approach. So I wanted to hear some of her secrets for giving good advice, with the hope that those skills can help all of us looking ahead to 2025. So you have said before that one of the things that makes you good at giving advice is knowing what makes advice not work. So let's get that out of the way first. What makes advice not work, in your opinion?
Sure. Well, the really bad advice, I think we can all agree, comes from this place of shame and judgment from the person who's giving the advice, right? They're assuming something's wrong with you. You should feel ashamed for even being in this situation, right? And it just feels like no one is really wanting to accept advice within that headspace. But sometimes just like flippant bad advice just comes from a place of not being able to see another person's perspective or can't even imagine that someone would be in this situation, right? On Life Kit, we think a lot about like money advice, right? We give a lot of financial advice, and we never want to think, oh, well, you don't have $2,000 in your emergency account. That's so bad. You need to work on that.
Right.
Where instead we try to be like, let's actually like see what you can do, right? And so good advice, it comes from a place of non-judgment, and it's an honest place of wanting to help and being really open. As soon as you're in the trap of like giving advice and you're saying, well, this is the only way that this is supposed to be, I don't think that's helpful for anyone. And then when you receive really good advice, it almost feels like this aha moment, right? It kind of crystallizes something for you where you're like, wow, I never thought about it, or it's landing in a different way for the first time for you.
Is there a time that comes to mind when you got some really bad advice?
Yeah, I mean, this comes from a place of, I think this person just wanted to give me a solution because I kept complaining about singleness. The idea of just treat singleness and dating like it's a job, meaning you should put all of your energy into it, like play the numbers game, right? Like that's a favorite one people like to trot out to singles. This idea that I had to put so much obsessive passion that I do into my career into dating, it doesn't make a lot of sense because getting into a relationship requires the consent of someone else, right? And so I think it was not bad that it was in the sense that it was judgmental, but it was more just like not seeing the realities of modern dating and, attacking it with that same vigor of a job search just makes for a recipe for burnout.
It's funny you say that because you and I both are in professions where research is a key component of what we do. We kind of spend all of our time, on the internet looking for the answers to things, understanding about how other people live. And I feel like for me, that has kind of made it a challenge to not treat my own personal problems with that same level of rigor and intensity. Like I make my own problems into a work research project.
Right.
I'd love to hear about how you handle that as someone who has a very similar kind of professional job. How do you approach getting advice for things that you need advice on in your own life?
Yeah, I think you're right. We're both in this career where you feel like if we just like dig a little deeper, if we make one more phone call, we can get to the bottom of something. And I think a lot of the advice I've had to learn that works for me is that there are a lot of options and that overthinking is not actually the answer, which is
Mm.
something I learned about in the research of my book. This idea that you can think yourself out of a problem is actually counterintuitive to how our brains work. If it's a problem like, how am I going to land this interview, right? Like, what are all these other ways? Like, you can come up with finite examples of how to close that loop and then you can move on. But if it's a question like, why am I still single or why do I feel this bad? That's more existential. You can't actually place that same level of rigor of thinking to that problem because what happens with rumination is that there's a lot of self-blame that happens, right? And they're usually questions that don't have an answer. And so what I learned from my research is sometimes it's best to actually just take a pause and take a break. Sometimes the answer will come to you more out of the blue. And sometimes these big existential questions, they don't have answers, and that's okay too.
Yes, I love that. So we have been talking about the you of today who has written this book, who is, years into your career working on Life Kit. But I'd love to go back to the beginning of when Life Kit was emerging and understand a little bit about who Meghan was at that point in time.
Yeah. So before I worked on Life Kit, I was at another NPR podcast that has since been sunsetted called Invisibilia. And it was all about human behavior. And it was deep in psychology and big ideas. And I got tapped to start this service journalism show that eventually became Life Kit. And I thought to myself, God, I really want to keep doing this type of journalism, this long form, character driven. And Yoe Shaw, who was worked on the show with me, was like, everything helps everything. And that is one of the best pieces of advice I ever got is like, your experience in this one place will inform your next journey, right? And I did not see myself as an editor, as a showrunner, and I could feel these kind of new powers kind of growing within me. And it was, that kind of classic thing of proving you can do something you didn't think you could do. And it honestly changed my life.
You said you got tapped, and I want to know more about that. Are you someone who was always giving advice to people in your life? Were you kind of someone that your colleagues turned to and they were like, aha, okay, Meghan is the right fit for this? Or what do you think it was about kind of you and your advice giving personality that made you get tapped for that?
Yeah, one of the best pieces of feedback I've gotten about my style of work and how I work in a team is that I never add fuel to a fire. And what I take that to mean is I don't escalate just for the sake of escalating. I really start to think about, okay, what are the different angles here? What are the different stakeholders? How can we approach this in the right way? Whether it is just taking a pause, let's take a beat and come back to this, right? That's always an option. Or let's just try something different. And I think my natural personality is I am just curious about other people. And also being a journalist, I want to make sure it's advice that is worth giving, right? Like I like being able to say, hey, if you try this, it might help you. And, I like giving those resources to people. So I think when I was tapped to do Life Kit, part of it was that I was like a steady presence. And I'm also a generalist at heart. I love knowing a little bit about a lot of different things rather than a lot about one subject. So that kind of dovetailed perfectly into Life Kit to be able to deep dive into a lot of different topics and respect the listener and make sure they're getting really good advice.
So I want to talk about that respect piece because as a listener of Life Kit, one of the things that I admire is that it seems like you all consistently have people that I want to be getting advice from. And that's not always true for like other advice columns I read or other advice shows I listen to. And so I'd love to hear about kind of your personal philosophy on like who to turn to get advice from. How do you find the right person to get the advice that you need for a given topic?
Sure. So I always think of Life Kit as that friend that happens to know a lot about a subject that you always call or text first before you start doing something, right?
Uh-huh.
So it's not going to be an exhaustive manual because I don't think anyone would ever want to listen to that kind of podcast, right? But someone who you can get kind of quick lay of the land and can give you a few like high level ideas, and it's always super practical, and that you're going to have some like key takeaways to like run with and then get going as soon as you listen to the podcast. And also from there, one of our key tenets is that we're really friendly and we're approachable, right? Like I knew from an early time at Life Kit, we were never going to be the podcast that tells you to do something very risky, right? That might have a really high payoff, but could also really harm you. That just didn't seem like a very NPR way to approach things and not how I am either. So I wanted the advice, like I said, to be responsible and respectful, and it's very friendly. And so when we're looking for people to book, we're looking for people who also kind of fit that bill, who are friendly and but also have thought really deeply about subjects and are experts. And they're not always super like, well-known people that have books, right? Sometimes it's just we make sure we find that really good gastroenterologist, right? Or a cardiologist that can talk to you about heart health, that can really explain things on a human level rather than, in a way that feels really inaccessible. And if you stick to those ideas of, being respectful, inclusive, friendly, it kind of naturally has us find the right experts for the episodes.
Well-curated and accessible expert advice is something that Life Kit has become known for. Their episodes about credit scores helped me understand my own credit score for the very first time. While Meghan loves this kind of expert input, she also gets a lot of advice from her mom. We'll hear more about that just ahead. You're listening to Embodied from North Carolina Public Radio, a broadcast service of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok. We're at EmbodiedWUNC. You can also hear Embodied as a podcast. Follow and subscribe on your platform of choice. We'll be right back.
Hey y'all, it's Amanda Magnus here, executive producer of Embodied. In 2025, we would love to give you some good advice. So what are your burning questions about sex, health, and relationships that we can help you with? Advice will be coming from our host, Anita Rao, and a couple of other experts that she's going to pull in along the way. Record the question that you would like advice on by leaving us a voice memo. You can do that in our virtual mailbox, SpeakPipe. You can find that link in the show notes of this episode or send us an email to embodied@wunc.org. We can't wait to hear from you and answer your burning questions.
This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. The last piece of really great advice I got was from my friend Hannah. After waking up from yet another anxiety dream about a big life decision, I sent her a 3-minute-long voice memo. She responded with an incredibly simple yet poetic phrase. You always have full permission to change your mind. Those words were gold, and a reminder that good advice can take you from a place of total stuckness to a place of calm. Meghan Keane is a pro at giving this kind of counsel. She's the author of the new self-help book, Party of One, and the founder of NPR's Life Kit. When she needs advice, her go-to person is often her mom.
My mom was a social worker here in Washington, D.C. at St. Elizabeth's, and she worked with a population who had, addiction issues and mental health issues that she helped them basically find jobs and did like career counseling for them, helped them find suits to go on job interviews, things like that. And so I think that really shaped how she sees a lot of life and how to help people and think about how to talk to different types of people about how to get what they need or what they want. And my mom has a really good emotional intelligence that I think she gave to me. And I think she is really good at looking at a situation and kind of seeing the different forces that are at play with people. And then, okay, how do you proceed from there? I would say her best advice beyond cooking. She's a great cook. She can always give me good kitchen hacks. So she's good for that, but she's also really good at navigating social situations and how to talk with people. Because I think so much of professional life is dealing with other people and we're never taught how to do that, right? But yeah, I think she's the advice giver who really can see the emotional landscape and do that kind of people work and give you good advice about that.
You say that she's really emotionally intelligent and that you have kind of developed that as well. Do you think that that is a skill that can be cultivated? Because I feel like as an advice giver, you want to be emotionally intelligent, but can people who maybe are bad at giving advice become more emotionally intelligent? Like, is that a learned skill?
Yeah, I do think it is. And, all it takes is showing people other perspectives. And I think a little bit of humility and vulnerability and wanting to learn how to give different advice is good. And I think all it takes is like, a little bit of empathy and a little bit of open to like learning and curiosity. Like, for instance, I think about we have an episode on Life Kit about how to help a friend who's grieving. And it's an episode that talks a lot about like, what things can you say or not say or actions. And, for me, I'm someone who lost a father about 20 years ago now. And I was like, I think I know everything about grief. But
Hmm.
then, I've had friends now, I'm in my mid 30s who've lost siblings, right? They've lost partners. And it's a type of grief I've never experienced. So but I've been noticing how if I just stay open and receptive and be present, I can give advice in a way that is appropriate to their experience, even though it's not my direct lived experience.
How do you balance that? Because I think there's a tendency when someone asks for advice and you have that experience. This happened to me the other day. Someone was talking about getting into a long distance relationship, and my partner and I are coming to the end of a long stretch of long
Mm-hmm.
distance. And I felt my immediate instinct was to just be like, here are the things you do. Schedule visits every 3 weeks, do this and do that. And like using your personal experience as a way to inform the advice you give while not overdoing it. Because there is that feeling when someone gives you advice where you're like, you're just talking about yourself. This isn't even
Yeah.
relevant to me. So, how do you balance that? Like, what to share from your own experience versus where to gather insight and information from somewhere else?
Yeah, I think that, well, one, I think you should always just like hear out the person first, right? What are they actually struggling with before you go, ooh, I have an idea, which I sometimes have to like, calm myself down because I do have a nice reservoir of reporting that we've done on
Exactly.
Life Kit. I have
Yeah.
to calm myself down, just being like a witness to someone, hearing what actually they are concerned about or struggling with, and then turning to them and being like, okay, I have some ideas. Are you open to hearing some? And getting that consent, as it were, and then kind of moving the conversation from a maybe like venting or, place of this is something I'm stressed about into perspective taking. I also think the phrase, what I have found helpful is
Mm.
helpful. So you can couch it as like, this is clearly my experience, and I'll tell you why these things worked, and not just pretending like they're universals that because you live this, it always works, right? In terms of like singleness, people will be like, well, I met my partner on a dating app, so therefore all dating apps are great. That totally washes away an experience that someone in front of you is having. And so I try to really make sure that whatever I have that is personal, it's very targeted and very short, because often when someone is talking to you and needing advice, they're not always ready to receive it, right?
Yeah.
And so having that moment of like, okay, like we heard you out. I have some ideas. Would you like to hear some of them? Here's what's worked for me. I'll tell you why. But if here's maybe an alternative or a flip side, and then knowing when to like kind of read the room and be like, okay, we're going to put this away for now. This person has kind of exhausted their resources at this moment. But sometimes people are like, they are excited. They're like, well, tell me more. Like I know I have friends who always call up other friends and they're like hungry for other people's experiences. So it is a lot of it just reading the room and the person in front of you.
I want to talk a little bit about your book, Party of One, and kind of continuing that thread that you were mentioning. I know that you grew up reading a lot of self help books, which are often written in a
Hmm.
way that's like, this is what you should do. Follow these 10 steps
Hmm.
and you'll be a better person. You'll be more successful. You'll be blah, blah, blah. What was your experience reading self help literature about relationships? And how did that inform your thinking about relationships before you started thinking about writing your own book?
Hmm. Well, I've always loved advice columns. I'm always just interested in like what other people are thinking. It's to me the black box of other people's human brains is fascinating to me. Like what's going on in there? Like what are you dealing with? And in college, I read a lot of memoir, which
Hmm.
I felt was like kind of an extension of advice columns in a way, right? Where it's like here's my lived experience, here's how I got through something, and I found those really powerful. And then I would say after a pretty big breakup I had in my mid to late 20s. I started voraciously reading self-help books because I was feeling bad and I wanted to feel better. And I was reading a lot of other journalists' self-help books. So there's a great one by Sarah Eckel called It's Not You, 27 Wrong Reasons You're Single. And I would just like underline and reread passages
Oh.
and go back and remind myself like, you're not alone. These ideas about why you're single are a lot of myths. And maybe the fact is that you're single just because you have high standards and you're not settling. And that's a good thing, right? Not a deficit. And then another book that I read was How to Be Single and Happy by clinical psychologist Jenny Tates, who I also ended up interviewing for my book. And I thought she and Sarah both take a really smart approach, which is like, it's not to say like, just be happy. Their approach was very, here's some evidence, why you should maybe even be more focused on living a good life. And for me, like lacing in these pieces of evidence, right, kind of help grounded me in a way that other self-help books that are just like, well, here's how to date and try rewriting your profile this way, right? Or just like, here are all these like mindsets that someone just makes up, were not helpful. So no surprise here, I gravitated towards journalists who were looking into data because then it just felt more like real and tangible to me.
So you had all of this data. You knew in your mind it is doable to be happy as a single person. There are many models of successful, happy single lives. All of these reasons that I've thought it was me or a problem, but there was something in your heart that was still not feeling great and feeling like some kind of loss. So talk to me about that dissonance and that disconnect between knowing it was perfectly fine and feeling like you didn't feel quite right.
Yeah, completely. Because you do see a lot of social media posts and conversation about how a lot of people are single and happy about it, right? Or they're child free, or, they're like, I never want to get married. And, researcher Bella DePaulo coined a phrase to describe that. It's called single at heart. And I was like, I don't think I quite fit that. But I love that that's happening. How do I get to feeling that anyways? Because it seems like a good way to just go about life. And this disconnect, I think, was a result of living in a culture that really takes a lot of time to have propaganda and push the idea that marriage is the only way to be happy and a whole human. And, I'm in my mid 30s. I kind of knew that the Disney princess life was not real, right? I knew all these things, but even still, these messages still were seeping in. And I think that's what created the disconnect. So I was thinking to myself, okay, how do we bridge these things so I can live a happy life no matter what? And what that meant was focusing less on, okay, now how do I get the relationship right? Because as soon as you make a relationship a goal, it's immediately pass fail, right? You either have it or you don't. And I was like, okay, well, how do I live a full life that feels fulfilling? And how do I sit with my emotions, even if I'm sad? How do I deal with rumination? All these things that feel very internal as well. A lot of being single is that you're spending a lot of time on your own. And so you can be stuck in your own head sometimes and not see the forest for the trees. And I wanted to be able to give resources for how to have a happy internal life and then push that out to your external life as well. So no matter what your relationship status, you felt good with your own company.
One of the things that you do really well in this book is encourage people to get really clear about what they're longing for. And there's a way to just have this kind of like, oh, I'm longing for a partner. And it's like, what do you want from a partner? What are the specific things that are missing in your life? And reading through that and thinking through that was really helpful for me in reframing this conversation that I feel like has been happening a lot in the past few years about loneliness and the loneliness epidemic. And I'd love for you to help us kind of understand your personal distinction between loneliness and being alone and figuring out what you're actually longing for when you say you're longing for a relationship.
Yeah, there's often this idea that, singles are so lonely, right? That if you don't have a romantic partner, you are automatically lonely. And well, one, that's just kind of unfair because the research shows that singles often have more social connections than married people. So that's just not true. But then it stigmatizes loneliness, which is, as we know, an epidemic, especially in America. And the reality is that anyone can be lonely at any time. So understanding the difference between alone versus lonely, I think is very helpful. So lonely is the state of being dissatisfied with being alone. And alone is just you happen to be by yourself. I'm alone in this apartment right now. Well, I have my dog Margot. So I guess I'm not technically fully alone, but there's no other humans here, right? So I'm alone, but I'm not lonely. I'm in conversation with you. We're connecting, right? And I ran into this research a few years ago from the late University of Chicago researcher John Cacioppo, who's, was like a preeminent scholar on loneliness. And what he found from his research is that loneliness is kind of akin to this biological signal, like thirst or hunger, right? And you wouldn't feel bad about asking for a drink of water if you're thirsty or trying to get something to eat if you were really hungry. Loneliness is just telling you, hey, you should seek out some social connection right now. And I think once you boil down that loneliness is a kind of neutral signal that your body is trying to tell you something, you're more able to get what you need. I know it's not just as simple. I know there's a lot of barriers and, other circumstances that prevent people from sometimes seeking out connection, right? But I think once you start to understand, oh, I'm feeling lonely, maybe it's time I do text that friend or reach out to them or set up plans for another time or just make a phone call, making these small gestures to then bring you closer to a community or family and connection. You see an off-ramp from the loneliness. And I think that's just a kinder way for all of us to be and to think about loneliness.
For people who maybe feel like they are where you were, where they had that disconnection between the head and the heart of knowing things and feeling another way, are there like particular practices that you would offer to help kind of integrate the knowledge and get clear about kind of moving out of that place of kind of spinning around?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did a lot of research into techniques that come from dialectical behavior therapy, and that's a DBT. And that's a school of psychology and thought to help people deal with difficult emotions. And a lot of suffering that comes from being dissatisfied with the state of singleness is resistance, right? I mean, that's kind of the root of a lot of frustration, right? Is you want something, you can't have it, and you're resisting that. So one of the tools in DBT is radical acceptance. It's just noticing that you're resisting, taking a beat to say, I notice that I'm resisting, and then just telling yourself things are exactly how they are right now. And it doesn't mean that you have to like the circumstances. And it's also not an excuse to be in a harmful or bad situation. It's basically helping you deal with the reality that is in front of you and accepting it, and then moving forward with intelligence. And then another wonderful tool I love from DBT, another acronym here is ABC Please. And so the please part of the equation is essentially making sure that you're eating well and kind of the basics of well-being. But the ABC part is super helpful. It's accumulating positives. So making sure you have something to look forward to every day or do something that feels good, right? Getting cuddles in with my dog, Margot, making plans. And then the B is building mastery. And so that just means doing something that makes you feel accomplished, just things that you can have that like cross off your to-do list feeling, right? And then C is coping ahead, which is just looking ahead to a scenario where you're probably going to be frustrated or sad or angry, and just imagining yourself doing really well in that scenario. It's kind of a way to not necessarily like rehearse exactly what you're going to say, but to think, oh, I'm going home for the holidays. I know that this aunt is going to ask me about who am I dating, and this uncle's going to be really invasive about my dating life. I'm going to imagine myself just like brushing it off and then passing the Christmas ham and everything's fine, right? And I know these things sound very like small, but together they do have an impact where they basically are building up your positive reserves. And so that you are noticing more of the good things in life and building up that confidence.
So this kind of brings me to this difference between asking for support and asking for advice, two things that are often conflated. How do you approach this in your own life? Do you preface something by saying, I'm not looking for advice, I'm just trying to say this out loud? Or do you have some kind of tools or ways you help flag to people in your life, whether you're actually looking for them to give you advice or you're just looking to get some support around something?
I mean, you nailed it. I just communicate it, right? Sometimes I know I am in a like high arousal, very emotional state where I am very angry or I'm very frustrated and I know I'm not thinking clearly. And so those aren't the times when I really want to hear advice because I'm not receptive to it. And sometimes if I call my mom, I'll be like, I just need to vent right now. And then we can think more about what to do next. But let me just tell you what is bothering me. And then often sometimes when I think back to those times when I vent, I'm like, wow, I was a little over the top, or like that actually wasn't how I actually feel about this situation. But yeah, just saying like, I actually just need to like talk about this right now and vent about it is super helpful. And it's interesting. I didn't realize that it was something that was actually really beneficial to myself until I started doing some more research. There's this psychologist and neurologist, Ethan Kross at University of Michigan, and he reminded me that venting, another word for it is co-rumination, right? And rumination, as we know, is when you're just kind of spinning your wheels a little bit and you're not actually getting anywhere. And what he said to me was, look, venting is fine as long as you get to a point then where you can get into perspective shifting mode. And he also talked to me about how a risk of venting and only staying in the venting stage is that you burn out your friends and loved ones if they hear the same thing over and over again and they're not seeing change or even a different mindset about it. It gets kind of exhausting, right? And so it's not to say like you have to now have a perfect attitude and you're always going to go get them, right? But thinking, okay, what's a perspective changer for myself that would actually help, and to hear from a friend like, I've been through this before, I can get through it again. Or, I just need support, like, or just offering someone like, I don't know what to tell you or like what would make it better, but I just really love you. Sometimes in place of advice, just like sending someone like compassion is like really helpful. And I think we've all been there where it's like, not everyone can relate to everything or have the perfect piece of advice, but it goes a long way to say like, man, that sounds really tough and I really love you and I'm here for you.
Say less and be present more. That is advice I will definitely be taking. But are there any special case rules for advice for topics like dating or sex? I'll put that question to Meghan just after this break. As always, follow Embodied on Instagram and TikTok. We're at EmbodiedWUNC. You can also hear the podcast version of this show by following Embodied on your platform of choice. We'll be right back. This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. If 2025 is the year you're hoping to become known for giving good advice, Meghan Keane has some tips. She's the founder of NPR's Life Kit, so she knows what she's talking about. One important first step, she says, is to avoid any shaming or judgment. Another non-negotiable for her personally is no unsolicited dating advice, which is a little funny since her recently published book, Party of One, is all about rethinking relationships.
Yes. So since writing the book, I mean, this is not a reveal. I'm very public about this. I actually did get into a long-term relationship. And it was actually really interesting to write the book while I was entering into this relationship because I was like, oh, I still need all these skills.
Yeah.
I still need to, think about how to decenter, a romantic relationship, to keep good friends in my life, to think about my rumination, to handle and process my own emotions. And one of the big things that also had really keeping myself and my partner accountable on is how we treat our single friends. And one of them, like you said, is I don't offer dating advice because one, I never know if someone of my friends is actively dating a lot or not dating and what that means for them or what kind of reaction they're going to have. I also don't offer dating advice because I don't know anything about how I actually found my partner other than it happened. It wasn't that I was more spiritually enlightened or I used this one technique or whatever. It was luck and timing, And I also don't want to treat my single friends' dating life like it's entertainment, right? I don't want to make it seem like it's the most interesting thing about them. They have passions and work and hobbies and dreams and, a lot of other things I can talk to them about. So my rule is I don't give dating advice unless someone explicitly brings up their dating life and then says to me, you need to give me advice. And to the point now where I have friends who basically shake me by the shoulders, like proverbially being like, yes, you were allowed. I'm giving you consent. Like, they're like, I know your dumb rules. And even then, if they're asking me genuine advice of like, hey, I'm dating this person, here's all this like information about them. What are your thoughts or feelings? I really try to approach it with such like care and like reason, because I also have single friends who come to me who say, oh, my friend really doesn't like the person I'm dating. And they were like, you need to dump him right now. And they're like, people can go to extremes. So this is a long way of saying that I try to treat my single friends like almost like they're other romantic partners in my life, like I watch their dogs. I make sure I hang out with them one-on-one. I don't bring my partner to every hangout, right? I give them birthday gifts. I pick them up from the airport if they ask me. I try to go out of my way when I can because, I want to make sure that they know that they're a part of, my community.
How about sex advice? Does your hesitancy around dating advice also extend to sex?
Weirdly, no. I think that's just because that's like what girlfriends talk about a lot of times, And so for me, talking about sex is more like, this is what I've found and what's interesting to me. And like, oh, has that been like part of your experience? It's kind of like you're just trading information, right? I mean, that's advice I know, but
yeah,
rather than being like, definitely do this or whatever. And so I think it's kind of like an open part of, girlhood, as it were, and female friendship in particular. It's interesting though, because there's this like idea that singles have no privacy when it comes to sex and relationships, right? That their sex life is up for discussion at any moment. And and if you're in a couple, it's like behind this like veil of secrecy, right? And privacy. So I definitely don't just like offer it fresh off the cuff after how are you doing? But reading the room to know it's like appropriate time and safe time to talk about it.
Okay, so to end this show, we are going to see your advice-giving skills in action, listening to some clips that we got from listeners. So first, this is a message from Gretchen.
Okay.
I'm 62-year-old white woman, divorced with grown children and sort of toying around in the dating arena. But at 62, it is challenging. And also recognizing how much I value my personal space, my solitude, getting to know myself at this phase of my life. I'd love to hear more conversations with older women, choosing singlehood or not, and all of the cultural influences throughout our lives.
Okay, so what are your initial thoughts on advice for older single women like Gretchen on finding community and figuring out whether or not to date?
Yeah, I would say that Gretchen is actually in a kind of great scenario because she, I think, is what Marissa Franco, this researcher who I interviewed in the book, she calls transitioners, people who are in a phase of life where there's a big change happening, right? They're divorced or they moved or they're just in a new life stage, right? And those are the people who are also willing to like make new friends and make new community. And so what Marissa told me is look for other transitioners in your life. Think about who else like has an interest that you like and put yourself out there more in the friendship space. Actually, I know that's like usually a phrase people use for dating, but put yourself out there for friendship and community. And, I don't say these things to be like, okay, this is how you're going to now meet someone to date necessarily. It's more like, the more places you can find community and with new people, the better your life will feel in general, I think. And then dating becomes less of the only kind of like, personal hobby that you have. And because then you have all these wonderful things going on. If you like your own space too, having a hobby is a great way to also cultivate that. And then I would say also in terms of, finding other, maybe single women around your age who are more invested in being single is like when you find people like that in your life, even if you don't know them that well, is just make the invitation. Or I think we're often
Yes.
so scared to reach out to people, but I have never gotten an invitation to a social thing that I'm like, why did they invite me? Like even if I'm like, you know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
it's not that like, maybe I'm like, oh, I'll be tired or whatever. Like my life, things are a little crazy right now or whatever. But I've never been like offended that someone invited me. And so when people see that you've made the effort to invite them to something like, hey, we're actually going to go to the movies this week. Would you like to come? Or, hey, like I hear you talking about starting a writing group or wish you had more time to write. Like, I love going to this cafe. Would you join me? And like maybe we could, chat about writing or something. You know, putting a box around the kind of time that you're doing and making that invitation, I think one kind of, obviously ups your chances of building friendship and community. And then two, people are more likely to then ask you to things, right? And to invite you to things because you thought of them. So yeah, I would say look for other people who are in similar situations as you and then make the invitation.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I would add is we did a show earlier this year about gray divorce. And I think for Gretchen, like there are so many other people who are in your exact boat right now. Many people that are kind of unraveling these narratives that they have inherited about what their lives should look like at this point in their life and who are kind of reconfiguring relationships with their kids and so many of the things that Gretchen is going through. There's like a huge cohort of other people going through as well. So yeah, find other transitioners. I think there is a lot of community out there for you.
Totally.
Okay, the next one is also relationship related, but a little bit more about friendship. This is Nick.
What's the secret to maintaining friendships as you get older among all of your different peer groups? People who might be in different life situations. Some people might be caregivers to parents. Some people might be caregivers to children. Some people might be in wildly different income brackets. Some are partnered, some are single. What's the secret to bringing them all together and maintaining a through line for yourself? As a parent to two young kids, it feels increasingly hard just to come up with conversation topics among people I've known for years.
All right, Megan, what do you have to say to Nick?
Sure. I'll answer the last part of his question first, where he said he feels like he has not a lot of conversation topics to pull from people he's known for years. And I would say that's an opportunity to get really curious about your friend again. This is something that comes from the director of the Harvard Development Study that looked at a series of like it was something like 700 men over like decades and decades. And they found that the key to a happy, healthy life was relationships of all kind. They didn't single out marriage. They didn't single out romantic relationships. They said relationships of all kinds. And one of his pieces of advice was exactly that. Get curious about people you've known for forever. Ask them a question that you've never asked them before, right? Dig a little deeper. I think that'll help deepen a friendship. And then two, I would get a little creative about how you spend time with that friend. I'm a big fan of short, spontaneous hangouts now because I think it's the kind of time spent that people actually crave. Because I think right now, so many people are like, can't wait to see you. Are you available 3 months from now? Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, well, that's because we think, oh, spending quality time means a dinner, drinks, right? Like hours and hours. And it's not, that's part of the equation. And those are obviously really awesome or like a weekend away or whatever. But I find if you can be spontaneous about being like, hey, we're going to go like pick up bagels real quick and then go to the park. Are you around? Or like, I'm in your neighborhood. Do you just want to go for a quick walk? Or I'm running an errand. Do you want to tag along? They might say no. There might not be the friend who wants to do those things. But I find that when I offer these kind of like quick, spontaneous moments of friendship, people are like, oh, that's great. Like, I can't today, but I'll try you next time. Again, it's that idea that they'll be like, it just, increases these opportunities to see each other. Because I think that's the kind of friendship that we all kind of miss from college, right? Where you're like walking down the dorm hall and you just have these kind of like quick moments of, hey, we're all hanging out down the hall. Do you want to hang out? Right?
Yes, exactly. And I think also, I mean, I can't believe I'm saying this as a millennial who is like really averse to the phone, but I was,
Call them.
I was recently out of town for a couple of months and I had a friend who's like really lovely about being intentional about friendship. And she's like, how about you, like when you're driving to the grocery store, you just try calling me and like do that for the whole 2 months you're there. And like, I'm sure at some point it'll like, we'll line up and I'll be able to answer and we'll be able to catch up. And I was like, you know what? That's actually like, it takes the pressure off so much because I'm not like trying to set up a time for a virtual phone date. I'm just like, I'm going to call you. I'm going to try. And we're going to just like hope that, you know, hopefully with like spontaneity and serendipity, I think it does work out. And the effort makes a big difference. You feel more connected just knowing that that person was thinking about you.
Yeah, it feels good too. When I get a phone call from a friend who I haven't talked to in a while, I'm never like, why haven't you called me? Or, you know, we haven't been talking. It's like, oh, I'm so glad you called me. Thanks for calling.
Exactly. Okay, last one about something a little bit more big picture from Daniel.
Okay.
I am thinking about, or have been thinking about, a big life shift in terms of going back to school and like trying to apply for a PhD program. But I don't really feel like I have the tools to like evaluate whether or not that's the right decision for me. So I'm trying to understand, how can you know when a big life change is the right move for you?
Okay, Megan, I think y'all have done a Life Kit episode on like making a big life change. So
yes, we've done
tell
a
it to
few.
me.
Yes. So, well, one, there's the financial aspect, right? Can you afford to go back to school, right? That's a whole other question. I'm a huge fan of getting under the values of a goal, because a goal can honestly kind of feel a little random, right? Where it's just like, I want a PhD. It's like, okay, well, why do you want a PhD? What values are being fulfilled as a result of getting the PhD? Because once you get that and you spend several years and time and energy and money doing that, if it's just to get the piece of paper, that's not going to really fulfill you, right? So thinking about like, okay, what values are going to serve this goal? And are they values that I really embody already? Are they values that I think are actually important? Are they values that I want to work on more? Because values and how you step into them drive your behavior more than just being like, I want this thing, because it's harder to work towards, I just want this one thing because I want it. So I would really examine your values, and is your behavior actually matching those values, and can you see moving towards it? Because it's also then getting under the hood of maybe I don't actually want the PhD. Maybe I want to just read more and I value academia. And so maybe it means I want to join like a book club with fellow nerds about this topic or whatever, right? Or maybe it is actually, yeah, I really do want this PhD because it's going to advance my career, and I care about, working hard and making sure that I advance my career in this way. So I would think about, the why and the values underneath the goal, and that should hopefully reveal the answer.
I love that. Okay, to wrap up, I am going to ask you to do something that you all do on Life Kit spontaneously. If you were to give 3 takeaways for how to give good advice, what would they be?
Sure. Okay. Takeaway 1, come from a place of being non-judgmental and being open to seeing other people's experiences and being open to a lot of different ways of how something might get done. So yeah, no shaming, no judgment. Takeaway 2, I would say read the room, know when it's time to give the advice or when it's just time to let your friend vent, and ask for permission to give advice. And then 3, your experience is not the universal experience. Remembering that other people have gone through different things and have different triggers and have different kind of mindsets, and, giving the personal anecdotes in like little bits and pieces, but don't just assume the way that you did it and it worked out for you is the way it's always supposed to be done. And then I guess a bonus one is sometimes you don't need to give advice. Just holding space for someone and giving compassion back to them and being there for them and saying, I'm here for you, is good enough sometimes.
You nailed the assignment. Meghan Keane, thank you so much for the conversation. It was such a pleasure talking with you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Meghan Keane's new book is called Party of One, Be Your Own Best Life Partner. I want to also give a special thanks to folks who sent us their thoughts and advice questions. Gretchen, Nick, and Daniel, thank you. If you have anything you want Embodied to talk about or anything you need advice on, the Embodied inbox is always open. Send us an email, embodied@wunc.org. You can also leave us a message in our virtual mailbox SpeakPipe. Find that link in the show notes of every podcast episode or on the sidebar of our website, embodywunc.org. You can also find Embodied on Instagram and TikTok. Our handle is @EmbodiedWUNC. Today's episode was produced by Kaya Finlay and edited by Amanda Magnus. Nina Scott is our intern, and Jenny Lawson is our technical director. Quilla wrote our theme music. This program is recorded at the American Tobacco Historic District. North Carolina Public Radio is a broadcast service of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm Anita Rao, taking on the taboo with you.